Okay, so for our first technique, we're going to look at the scumbling technique. What I have here is I started off by cleaning up my palette. I have a clean palette here. I've added a dab of medium, and I'm going to pick two colors. Now you can do whatever you like. If you want to do blue or red or purple or whatever you like, it doesn't really matter. I'm a big fan of neutral colors. So I'm going to choose two colors that I want to use. One of them, I'm using a nice burnt umber brown, and I'm also using a sort of a yellow ochre color that I mixed up as well. So this comes from my own collection. So if you wanted to use two blues, blue and orange is a complementary, red and green is a complementary, red and orange as an analogous color combination, blue and green as an analogous, anything that's in the same spectrum that's next to each other, adjacent colors, right? Those are analogous. So you can play around and create you create your own choices of color. All right. You'll need two paintbrushes. All right. Your one paintbrush is dedicated to each color. We don't mix back and forth, but for this technique, you need two paintbrushes. You'll need one of your pieces of Bristol board. All right. So if you bought the packet, what I've done is, this is for the entire assignment. I have divided this up into 4 equal sections. Ended up being, since mine is 11 by 17, this is 4 1/4. And I just made a swatch area that's 4 1/4 each for each of my 4 painting techniques we're doing. So in this case, I'm going to work on this area. I like things tidy, so I went ahead and put a piece of painter's tape here on the line. So I'm going to work between the line and the edge of the paper to create my scumbling exercise here. Okay, so to start off, scumbling is a very rough texture. It's a type of technique to give some interesting shape and texture to a scenic area, as opposed to just painting everything flat. If you've ever heard of the term a wet blend, this is sort of its chunky big brother. All right, so wet blend is when you take 2 colors of paint and you blend them together on the surface, and you get usually a very smooth, very soft look to them. With the scumbling technique, your goal is not to be smooth. Your goal is to have sort of a patchy look. It is reminiscent of camouflage. If you think of camouflage clothing, there's usually 2 or 3 colors that make up this very patchwork kind of look. And it gives a very a nice texture from far away. So if you think of like camouflage clothing, you're dealing with neutral colors, typically a green, a brown, maybe a black, maybe even a light green. And so those are very analogous in its combination. So we're doing a similar technique. The way we start this is very simple. You have your brushes. We make sure we don't have any hairs sticking in them. We kind of pull on the ends. We may have to trim our brush if we need to, right? We always start off by wetting our brush. So, wet your brush and wipe off the extra. This kind of preps the bristles to accept paint. We're going to do that with both of our brushes. All right. Sometimes this will even bring hairs to the surface that didn't want to pull out before. All right. So I'm going to kind of give another quick pull one more time to make sure I have all these loose hairs out. All right. So I'm going to wipe that off. It's always good to have maybe paper towel or a napkin or such ready there, so you can kind of wipe off the excess hair or excess water as well. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dip in my medium a little bit. And I'm going to start with one color. In this case, I'm going to jump into my burnt umber, and I'm going to just use this color straight. All right. The way we do this is we want to go in a figure 8 pattern. All right, so this is sort of an X shape. So I'm going to start by making these little X's, and you can see that my paint is in the middle between the thick paint and a it's not as thick as going straight, but it's not so thin that it's watercolor. See, I've got some brush strokes in here. All right, so I did a little area there. I'm going to grab some more, maybe come over here, do a little area there. Okay, maybe do a little bit here. Okay, so I'm going to set that brush aside, and I'm going to do the same thing. I add a little bit of my medium over here, and a little bit of my yellow ochre color. And I'm going to go and I'm going to slightly overlap what I did before. You see, I'm making this little X pattern. It's sort of a chunky texture that you're creating. You overlap a little bit. Some of this, you can see some of the darker brown underneath that's kind of coming through. I'm kind of going to go in this area. Overlap, not overlapping everything, just a little bit on the edge, cross the edge a little bit. All right, a little more medium, a little more. Now for this purposes, you can see I'm using a palette to mix my color. Now I got to give a little bit of explanation here, because in scenic artistry, we don't use palettes so much. All right, what we use is pre-mixed paint. Our paint, we spend a lot of time in the lab looking at the paint elevations that come from the set designer. And what we do is, as we look at those paint elevations, we're going to choose the best technique to actually execute the style of that paint elevation, right? So we will sit down and play with our colors. We'll mix, we'll find the right mix, and we make gallons and gallons of paint that are the correct color. And we also spend some time making samples like this sample here to find the correct technique out of our, toolbox of scenic art techniques to use to create the designer's desired look for the show. Okay, so where if you were an oil painter or an acrylic painter, you may sit down with a palette and work a painting for weeks and weeks to try to, get to your desired look. Scenic artist doesn't do that. The scenic artist is working with pre-made paints, has already done all the work of finding out what the set designer desired for the look, and is now has to execute it in a very quick time frame, because remember, we're usually under some form of a deadline to create the show, to get the show up and running and open. So we don't have time to just kind of futz around and paint a little bit and use a palette and try to find colors. We have to pre-do all that early. And typically a backdrop or a piece of scenery may only have a week at most, maybe only a couple hours to actually paint some of this. So there's no time to waste in painting a background. So we have to know our technique and know our paint colors before we actually start painting. All right. So this is one of the big challenges for a scenic artist, is to figure that all out. So as you can see, I'm making these kind of blotchy areas. I kind of go over, I'm making these little X patterns. It's very textural. So what does this remind you of? Some of it's brushy, some of it I'm using a little less medium, so I get more of a brush, brush stroke look to it. Some of it I'm going a little bit more medium in order to get a little more fluid, a little more liquidy. Right? We do lots of samples because we might find out, we want to actually add some water to it. Maybe we want more of a watercolory look to it. It's still a scumble. It's still, see, this is more watery. Let me bring this up. This is more watery, where this was more brushy, right? So depending on the quality of the look. Maybe it's more watercolory, or maybe the set designer had more of a brushy look. That's what we decide, and how much medium or less water and less medium, more pigment. That's how we decide how we want to apply our paint. So I just wanted to show this. I'm liking this more brush strokey look than I am the watercolory look, but you may not. Now, one thing to be aware of, don't dip in one and dip in the other. Stick this, this is my burnt umber brush. I set that one down. If I want to go to the yellow, I jump to my other brush. Right, so this is my yellow ochre. I'm going to brush that on top and kind of move it around. This is not a blend. This is a scumble. We're not trying to create one even look, right? That would be a wet blend. In a wet blend, our goal is to try to make sort of a gradation of color, sort of like I was trying to do with our tint exercise or before, you know, our tint and our shade. So you see as I do this. So what does this look like? What does this remind you of? To me, it looks like grass, or it looks like maybe some sort of earthy, you know, grassy area. I can use this technique with a lot of different things. So, right. A big hair here. This is one of the bad thing about these bristle brushes is these cheap brushes. They tend to shed. So every now and then you'll find a hair in your mix. So, all right, I've covered all this. Let's go ahead. I'm going to turn this, and you see I have this nice kind of very earthy, very natural looking, almost looks like grass. You can see that if I were using a large brush on a piece of scenery, like a backdrop or a floor, I can get a very interesting texture. I might use this technique if, say, I was doing a gray stone floor and I wanted the stone to have some texture to it. I might use different shades and tints of gray to create this sort of brushy stroke. If that's the case, I probably would use more water, less brush, more watercolory, and still get the same scumble to have all this different texture and change in tone and change in text. So this is the scumble. You can try to look at this. What I want you to do is to try to find something in nature, a photograph that shows something that reminds you of this, and try to play around with finding the colors that were in that photograph and mix them as well as apply them in this format. And you'll see that this texture works very, very well for creating natural looking textures, anything like a grass, stone. It's also a great base. So I might do more things to this if I were to create a layered process for a backdrop or for a piece of scenery by adding spatter on top of it, maybe layering glazes, very transparent glazes to get more texture or more layers. This is typically a really great texture, or a very good technique for a base texture just to get started. All right, so let this dry, experiment with your version of it. You can choose the same colors I did, or you can change different colors. All right, just know that a scumble is typically 2 or 3 colors that are mixed. In that case, if we have 3 colors, we'd have 3 brushes. Whether it was, especially if we're doing, say, a very cloudy sky, I might use a little bit more water with the medium. I would use probably 3 different colors. I'd use a blue, a tint of the blue, and a shade of the same blue. So they're all in the same type family of blues. And by using this technique in a little bit less wispy, but more watery, same kind of approach, I can get a nice, beautiful sky with a lot of different texture, a lot of cloudy look to it. All right, play around with that, do a couple experiments, and when you're satisfied with one, upload this as your Scumbling sample. All right, we'll move on to the next one.